Hi, everybody. We're waiting for more folks to join onto the Zoom. We're going to get started in just in just a minute or so. It's just 1 o'clock. Thanks for joining us, everybody. For our webinar today, just FYI that this webinar will be recorded today, and we're going to let a few more people join. We can see the participants ticking up, so just bear with us a few more minutes, and we will get started. And just as before we get started here, please use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen instead of the chat feature at the end of the session. Hopefully we'll have enough time for some questions and answers. And we would just ask that you put your name and your affiliation there and then submit the question, hopefully with about 15 to 10 minutes to spare. And we'll try and do our best to keep it to an hour today. We're ready to get started, I think. Thank you again for joining us. My name is Leslie Kimball. I'm the lead for communications and branding at Discus and responsibility.org. And I'm proud to be with you guys today. I'd like to welcome our speakers, Chris Swanger, President and CEO of Discus and responsibility.org, Christine Lacascio, Discus Chief of Public Policy, Philip Mcdaniel, CEO and co-founder of St. Augustine Distillery in Florida, Colleen Saig, our new manager of grassroots advocacy for Spirits United, David Osgo, Discus Chief Economist, and Sarah Fitzmaurice, Chief of Resource and Planning at Discus. So thank you again for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. First and foremost, we hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. Clearly, 2020 was an extraordinary year for all of us as individuals and for the country, and it was an extraordinary year for our industry as well. And what we hope to achieve today with y'all is to provide some insights on 2020, what happened to the industry in terms of a growth perspective. And in addition to that, we want to highlight what are some of the challenges and opportunities for 2021 as well. So thank everybody for joining, and we hope this will be an informational session for you. Next slide, Leslie. Well, first and foremost, as we reported at our economic briefing last week, which we do every year with media, it was an extraordinary year for the U.S. distilled spirits industry. Revenue growth for distilled spirits in the U.S. was up 7.7%. Volume growth was up 5.3%. And obviously, this provided opportunities, certainly for our great off-premise partners. But it goes without saying, many in the hospitality sector or on-premise partners, bars and taverns and restaurants have suffered mightily over the last year. We're pleased to report this past year was the 11th straight year of market share gains for U.S. distilled spirits. I'm sure you've all heard about the destructive tariffs that our industry has been navigating since June 2018. This is going to be a big priority for Discus, hopefully to resolve in the coming months with the Biden administration coming in, wanting to reset the relationship with the EU. This will be our number 1, 2, 3 priority out of the gate to get these tariffs eliminated and suspended and resolved. We've seen a great American success story dampened by 38% decline in American whiskey exports over to the EU. And my colleague, Christine Lacascio, will talk more about that. Uneven impacts, obviously, we've talked about the impact on many in the hospitality sector, and David Osgo, our chief economist, will talk about that as well. What's exciting, one of the unique issues related to the pandemic is we have seen new marketplace modernizations, and that's a great thing for our industry because the U.S. distilled spirits industry and many of you on the phone have really been on the front lines, helping to bring joy into consumers' lives and bring some levity during a very, very anxious time. So the market modernizations is obviously something that Discus has worked on along with many other industry partners as well. And we'll talk about that because I think the number one priority in terms of navigating through the pandemic is to really help do everything that we can to reset the hospitality sector so they come back strong and healthy. Next slide. Okay, well, certainly we wanted to talk about 2020 and some of the key victories. The Craft Beverage Modernization Tax Reform Act was a big one for the industry and many distillers around the country. Thankfully, and a big gratitude to members of Congress and everybody that helped us advocate loudly with members of Congress. It's always an effort to win share of mind with members of Congress to support key legislative propositions that can help our industry. And we're proud to report when Congress made the Craft Beverage Modernization Tax Reform Act permanent, that ultimately gives distillers around the country greater predictability. And of course, great kudos to governors and state legislatures around the country. As I mentioned, the economic relief measures that have taken place, cocktails to go in 33 states, pickup and delivery has all been an economic lifeline, certainly for industry partners all around the industry. And certainly Discus is going to be on the front lines trying to make some of these market modernizations permanent. Anytime you talk about the supply chain and the distribution of our great products, obviously responsibility has to always be top of mind as well. And it's on the forefront of everything we do. In addition to that, in April of this past year, Kentucky passed a direct shipping to consumer state. And many governors, and Christine will talk about this, have adopted intrastate direct shipping. That has been an economic lifeline for many of the distilleries in the states where that's been allowed. Let me just say this, Discus and all of our member companies recognize that the three-tier system and the strength of the three-tier system has really been the great foundation of this great marketplace. But obviously the pandemic has accelerated considerations for e-commerce. And we've seen great e-commerce platforms pop up and really blossom over the last couple of years, particularly with the pandemic, that are within the three-tier system. And we do believe direct-to-consumer shipping is another channel to meet the consumer's needs. So we are very, very committed to working with our distributor and our retail partners to find common ground. But our industry always has to be on the front lines with meeting the consumer needs. So there's an opportunity for the industry here, but we've got to do it with great consideration and always with high standards of responsibility. So 2020 was an extraordinary year, no doubt, and the first couple of months of 2021 is that as well. But let's hope the vaccine's going to get out soon, and the U.S. economy is going to start to stabilize. And just know that Discus is going to be out in front trying to advocate for the industry. So with that, Christine, over to you.
Thanks, Chris, and good afternoon again, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So we thought we'd start off by talking about the tariff issue and the impact of tariffs. And next slide, please, just to provide a little bit of historical background. The industry has enjoyed for over 2 decades, in essence, duty-free access between the US and the EU. And that has been so important, not only for our exports to the EU in terms of American whiskey, but also for the ability of our importers to provide a wide array of spirits to American consumers. And so importers, wholesalers, and our retailers and our on-premise partners to be able to provide products like Cognac and Scotch whiskey and Irish whiskey and products like that that can only be made in the EU market. Next slide. So what we've seen over the past couple of years, unfortunately, is an escalation of trade disputes that have unfortunately brought the distilled spirits in, disputes that have nothing to do with our industry. So as Chris mentioned, back in June 2018, the EU decided to impose a 25% tariff on American whiskey. That was related to the imposition of steel and aluminum tariffs. Back in October of 2019, in a completely separate dispute, the US decided to impose a 25% tariff on single malt Scotch whiskey, single malt Irish whiskey, as well as cordials and liqueurs from Germany, Ireland, Italy, Spain, and the UK. In November of 2020, the EU imposed a 25% tariff on US rums, brandy, vodka, and vermouth. And then most recently, at the end of last year, the administration made an announcement and imposed tariffs just a couple of weeks ago, a 25% tariff on Cognac and other great brandies from France and Germany, but limiting those to products that were valued at over $38 per proof liter. And on the horizon, as noted at the bottom, the 25% tariff on American whiskey is slated to double to 50% in June of 2021. And so this is obviously a big priority for us to try and seek some resolution to before that happens. Next slide. So when we look at just taking, again, a step back, looking at the decade in review, as we talked about, U.S. export growth had been really great up until 2018 with the imposition of these tariffs. And you see over the past decade that global U.S. spirits exports increased by almost 27%. And then comparing 2020 to 2018, which again is the year that the tariffs were imposed, total US spirits, if you compare those 2 years, were down 22.8%. And American whiskey, which accounts for the vast majority of our exports, were down almost 29%, comparing those 2 years. Next slide. Then we look specifically at our exports to the EU. The EU market is so important for our American whiskey exporters. It accounted for 52% of the value of total American whiskey exports. Many craft distillers that are new to the exporting market look to the EU as an established market to, take their first foray, their first step into the export markets, go there. And so it's critically important for us. And the UK accounted for 16% of those exports to the EU. But as this slide demonstrates in kind of dramatic fashion, you see that comparing the value of our exports in 2020 to 2018, we saw a decline of 53% in our exports to the UK and 38% in our exports to the EU after experiencing, many years of in some cases, double-digit growth. And next slide. So, this is not an issue that impacts, 1 or 2 or 3 states with the vast expansion of craft distillers. We now have 41 states that exported U.S. spirits in 2020, and 36 states exported American whiskey in 2020. Next slide, Leslie. So it really is a U.S. issue and one that involves, many producers around the U.S. When we look at the import side, next slide, Leslie, as I noted, there were new tariffs that were imposed a little over a year ago on single malt Scotch whiskey, a 25% tariff. And you see how imports of Scotch whiskey and the value had really been increasing quite a bit, 94% if you compare it, over the past decade, and then the steep decline of 37%. Now, understanding that the tariff is only applied to single malt Scotch whiskey, not all Scotch whiskeys, but you still see the huge impact that it has had over just the course of 1 year on the Scotch whiskey imports into the US. And then quickly also looking at liqueurs and cordials. It had been a pretty steady market for those products over the past decade, and then the imposition of the tariff, and we see 40% decrease over the span of 1 year. So looking at our policy and legislative priorities for 2021, as Chris said, resolving the tariff issue certainly is our top 3 priorities that we want to seek some resolution to. Next slide, Leslie. So we are working with our colleagues in the EU. We're working with our retail partners, with our wholesale partners, with craft distillers, with everybody throughout the industry to urge both the US and the EU to secure an immediate suspension of these tariffs. Now is not the time to continue to apply tariffs and have such a negative impact. It's almost a double whammy on the hospitality industry, which we know has been so devastated by the impacts of the last year and the closures. And so that is something we'll be working very, very diligently on, and hope that with the new administration, there is, as Chris said, an effort to secure a reset of the relationship with our allies in the EU and the UK to get that matter resolved as soon as possible. That is certainly our goal, and appreciate your help in urging for that. In addition, we will be working to secure further relief for the hospitality industry and any additional COVID relief bill. The Restaurants Act, we understand, we expect it to be introduced maybe as early as even today. And we will certainly be lending our support to that effort as we have in the last year to seek some relief for our hospitality industry broadly. On the state level, a couple issues we want to just flag. David Osgo will talk about the importance of the growing ready-to-drink product market. And from a policy perspective, we will be working to ensure that any legislation that pops up in the states that looks at spirits-based RTDs really treats them fairly and equitably relative to other RTDs that are made from other types of alcohol. So that's something we'll be working on. And as Discus has done in the past, we're going to be working to secure the repeal of bans on 7-day sales in South Carolina, North Carolina, Montana, Texas, and Mississippi, and hope to see some progress there. And of course, we're going to continue to urge against any tax increases. Now is really not the time to be putting additional taxes on our products, which certainly would be targeted at consumers and small businesses. And again, on outlet expansion, really pushing and urging Pennsylvania to expand outlets for spirits. We know that the outlets there are certainly well below the national average. I believe it's somewhere less than 1 per 10,000 people, but the national average is more a little bit greater than 3. And so expansion there could really help generate some new revenue in the state. And we're making that argument in the state and hope to see some progress there. And then the 2 other things, as Chris already alluded to, the marketplace innovations that we saw last year, cocktails to go, as a way to help the restaurant and bar industry get through to the best that they can through the COVID-19 related closures. We know that the restaurant industry has really, viewed that as a lifeline to help generate some additional revenue. And it was also something that consumers were asking for too, allows them to get something and take it home and have it safely at home. And so over the past year, 33 states, along with DC, where I am located, decided to allow cocktails to go in response to COVID-19, mostly via temporary measures, but 2 states did enact permanent laws to allow those moving forward. And so we're pleased to see that. And we know that approximately, the last count I had was there about 22 bills under consideration to either extend or make permanent cocktails to go. And that is certainly something that we will be working with our hospitality partners to advocate for that, as it is an important lifeline for the hospitality industry. And then secondly, just to note on direct to consumer, as Chris noted, this just gives you a snapshot of direct to consumer and the different provisions that are allowed for spirits. And we did see some temporary expansion of that last year in response to the COVID crisis, but now the marketplace is changing and consumers are pushing for this. So we know that consumers are pushing for it. There has been a transformation of where people shop just generally, and so it's an issue where Discus will be engaged and reacting to where it comes up. So with that, I am pleased to turn it over to Phil Mcdaniel from St. Augustine Distillery to provide some perspective from a craft distiller. Phil, over to you.
Thank you very much, Christine. I appreciate it, and welcome everyone. If we could go to the next slide, please. Well, as you're going to see here, there's a number of issues that have dramatically impacted craft distilleries across the country. Today, there's some 2,500 small businesses like ours who are pursuing the American dream to be able to make spirits in their communities from the agriculture where we live. And 2020 provided a number of challenges for us. Probably the biggest one for most of us, because a large part of our revenues are generated and customers are created when people come to our distilleries to take a tour and tasting. Being closed in some cases for the last 8 months has been devastating, and so it's been quite a challenge. The industry of tourism as well has fallen quite a bit, so that's been a major hit for a lot of us, and we're trying to reestablish our places in the marketplace. Perhaps one of the other biggest areas, as we all know, the food and beverage industry and our on-premise business, which for a lot of us is a significant piece of our business, has been closed or severely limited. And so we've kind of taken a triple hit, one from our tasting rooms, and the second is with our bar and restaurant partners. So we've really been, trying to figure out how to readapt. And many of us pivoted during the year to making sanitizer, and we're grateful to Discus and all the distillers around the country who were able to step up and make that happen. So that was really a good thing that helped us get through this. Probably the other thing, as Christine, hit quite a bit previously, is the impact that our export markets have had. Many hundreds of distilleries have found new customers and new markets in Europe through their spirits over there, particularly our whiskeys. I think the number was 36 states now export a whiskey to Europe, and to have significant tariffs now, 25 soon to be 50%, has been really difficult. So we're hoping that in the coming year, in the coming months, actually, we'll be able to put a big press on the federal government and our European partners to help relax those laws. Next slide, please. One of the main things that are going to help us turn this around is responding to the marketplace. And I think one of the things that's been great is, for many of us, our small, we have a lot of local and regional customers who want to support our businesses, and they've been asking us to be able to ship to them, wanting to order online. And we're grateful to those states who have allowed temporary access to those markets. And we're hoping to get more of those and see that made permanent. The marketplace has changed today, where people expect to be able to order things online and have it shipped home. So we understand how sensitive that is to our industry partners. We believe for sure that there is a way to strengthen the 3-tier through that, because we believe we create customers from our tasting rooms. They'll return back home and then want to continue to buy the product in their home state through the 3 tiers. So we believe that in the long run, that's a win. One of the main things we're looking for this year is making cocktails to go permanent, because that again will help support our on-premise accounts, and that'll be another way for them to stay stable and stay strong, and us to support them. Obviously, we truly feel that now that we had that giant win last year with the FET, and that was a great team effort with all the stakeholders in the industry to keep the FET at that lower rate. We have to make sure that the state excise taxes remain in place and don't go up as well. And again, as I said before, I think, working with our federal legislators and European partners to remove those tariffs, it doesn't make sense for anybody. It's a lose-lose proposition, and we could really use your help out there to engage on that. And the last thing I wanted to give a shout out to is Spirits United. It's a wonderful resource and tool. Our company used it significantly in the last 2 years to help get the message to Florida's state legislators and senators. We were really proud that 25 of 27 congressional members in Florida and both of our senators co-sponsored the craft beverage bill. And a large part of that was due to the work of all of our members here in Florida who use Spirits United. So I would encourage all of you to learn more about it and get involved. But with that, I'll turn it back to you, Christine.
Sorry, Thank you, Phil. That was so nice of you to say about Spirits United. We are always so proud to work with you. And so many of you are very familiar with Spirits United. For those of you who are not, I'd like to introduce you to our new manager of grassroots advocacy, Colleen Saig, and she can tell us a little bit more about Spirits United next.
Hello, thank you, Leslie. I'm Colleen Saig, and I will be leading our grassroots advocacy. I'm really looking forward to working with the Spirits United community and using our collective voice to engage on these really important issues that impact the spirits industry. So with that, if you have not already, definitely be sure to join us by signing up at spiritsunited.org. That way we can stay connected and ultimately ensure all adult consumers across the country can responsibly enjoy distilled spirits. So definitely sign up, and I look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Colleen. Sorry, let me get the, oh, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. All right, now I'd love to introduce David Osgo, who's our chief economist, and he'll walk us through the 2020 market numbers. Over to you, David. David, please unmute.
There we go. Obviously, as an economist, you never want to come on after someone as cheerful as Colleen, but I'm going to do my best to keep this lively for you all. In 2020, as Chris mentioned, we had what was really our best year in 40 years. I've been doing this for 20 years now. I looked at the data in the previous 20 years, and the 7% growth rate that we recorded was truly phenomenal. It's very unique times, and we recorded unique results. Our revenues were up by $2.2 billion to a total of about $31.2 billion in supplier revenues. Next slide. Now, we also like to measure ourselves in terms of volume. In volume, we grew volumes by 5.3 percentage points, adding almost 13 million cases to over 250 million cases across the United States. Now, prior to this year, we've been growing at between 2.5% each year, averaging over the last 10 or 12 years or so. And in fact, I look back, and in 2004, I believe it was, we had a growth rate of over 4%. 5.3% is the fastest we've grown in 20 years, and more than likely the fastest we've grown in the last 40 years. So really an exceptional year. Next slide. Now, we like to measure ourselves against the competition, namely beer and wine. And in this case, we see that in 2020, in terms of supplier revenues, so the revenues generated by suppliers, we grew our market share from 37.8% up to 39.1% of all revenues generated in the supplier tier. Now, each point of market share is worth around $800 million. So that means our gains in market share in 2020 added $1 billion in supplier revenues. Next slide. We also like to measure our market share in terms of volume, or as we like to say, share of stomach. Now, obviously, if you just looked at total gallons, beer would have a 90% market share. So what we do is we convert everything into standard drinks, 12 ounces for beer, 5 ounces for wine, and 1.5 ounces for spirits. And when you do that, you see that we grew our market share from 36.3% up to 37.2%. Now, again, each point of market share is worth around 6.7 million cases. Thus, our gains in market share in 2020 added 1 million cases to supplier sales. Next slide. Now, I have to say, growth was actually rather uneven across the year. For looking at just off-premise growth, so sales through package stores, grocery stores, what have you, we saw that over the 52-week period ending in the last week of December, volumes grew by about 16.3%. We've looked at various measures, and that's fairly consistent. But if you look at the same data source and look at the growth over the last 12 weeks of the year, that growth rate declined to 9.8 percentage points. And then if you look at just the last 4 weeks, it declined to just 6.6%. So clearly early in the year, as the pandemic started really going, as people started quarantining, staying home, you saw a lot of stocking up. Well, even though we continued a fairly nice growth rate, a lot of that growth was weighted toward March, April, and May, with things slowing fairly dramatically as the year wore on. Next slide, please. Now, we also like to look at our growth in terms of price point. We divide the market into 4 different price points: value, premium, high-end, and super premium. And as you can see, value brands were fairly flat this year as well as in 2019. All of our growth was really in the premium, high-end, and super premium really grew quite rapidly. Almost $900 million in total new revenue growth. And in fact, super premium accounted for 40%, super premium priced products accounted for 40% of our total revenue growth in 2020. Next slide. Let's take a look at, for a moment, how we grew. Now, there was actually very, very uneven growth. I mentioned that we saw very, very strong growth for the off-premise channels. They were up 18%. Well, that certainly was not the case with on-premise. With bars and restaurants closed, when we look at on-premise, their sales were actually down by 44 percentage points. Now, this continues to have a negative impact on the hospitality industry. When we look at employment in the hospitality industry, even by the end of the year, as a few states started to open up a little bit more, they're still down by 2.3 million jobs. And obviously, as Phil mentioned a minute ago, quarantining really had a negative impact on the craft segment. We did a survey with the American Distillers Institute, and the survey found that 36% of craft distillers reported that for the entire year, across all channels, their sales were actually down by 36 percentage points. By 25% or more. Now, 25% is a huge loss for any business, but it's particularly difficult for some of the smaller craft guys who might not necessarily have the financial resources that they need to really weather this storm. Additionally, even though across the spirits market in the US, things went quite well in 2020, that wasn't the case worldwide. And in fact, even looking at the phenomenal sales rate growth that we enjoyed in the US, that still was not big enough to overcome weakness in international markets. When you look at the major companies and you look at their total growth, on average, they're off by around 8% across the globe. So again, a lot of this has to do with the market structure internationally. Here in the United States, around 80% of all volumes, even before the pandemic, are sold through off-premise channels. But internationally, that's more like 50-50. So obviously, if 50% of your channels are going to be closed, or if the channels that account for 50% of your sales are closed, it's very difficult to overcome that challenge in making it up all through off-premise. Additionally, global travel retail, or duty-free as a lot of us like to call it, those sales went to almost zero. Clearly nobody was traveling, and if you're not traveling, you're not buying through duty travel retail. And a lot of those sales account for 1, 2, 3, 4% of some of companies that are in that channel. When we look at total beverage alcohol, so spirits, beer, and wine, accounting for all purchases, spirits obviously did well. Wine was up around 4%, but beer, even accounting for the growth in hard seltzers, they're only up for 0.4 of a percentage point. So when you look at total beverage alcohol across the United States, volumes were only up by around 3% in 2020. So again, we saw very, very uneven growth. Next slide. Now, let's talk about why we were able to grow revenues by 7.7% and volumes by 5.3 percentage points. First off, as I mentioned, that the market structure worked against international sales. But here in the US, around 80% of our volumes, again, even prior to the pandemic, came through off-premise sales. This really softened the blow from the on-premise closings. Now, obviously, if people were not going out and enjoying our products at bars and restaurants, if they weren't going out to dinner, they certainly were not traveling. This gave the consumer a lot more money to spend. In fact, I looked in, if you just look at the money that consumers would have spent on spirits in on-premise channels, it would have been $20 billion. So that's $20 billion that they then had to spend in the off-premise channels. So that also helped us grow our revenues. Additionally, Americans clearly are accustomed to entertaining at home. Many, many people have in-home bars. A lot of people have very fancy recreation rooms. So Americans were able to shift fairly quickly to in-home entertaining. Now, when you looked at the rapid growth rate we saw, say in March and April, and the decline we saw afterwards, a lot of what we saw initially was stocking up. In the early days of the pandemic, people were stocking up on everything. They were stocking up on paper towels, toilet paper. At my grocery store, they're actually rationing chicken. I mean, whoever's thought that we'd be rationing chicken in the United States? So I believe a lot of people were stocking up early on in the pandemic. We saw a lot of sales of the large format 1.75 liter bottles. So that stocking up led to part of our growth sales. And then finally, it's been mentioned before, but online and home delivery really made shopping easier. So a lot of the services that people can take advantage now to have product delivered to their doorstep really helped out and made buying more convenient for the customer. Next slide, please. So I want to just briefly talk about a few high categories, some of the where we saw significant growth or decline. American whiskey, bourbon, rye, white whiskeys, they did extraordinarily well in 2020. Volumes were up over 7%. Revenues grew even faster, and they grew faster again because a lot of the purchases were in those super premium categories. Looking at Cognac, Cognac is ideally suited for the purchasing that we saw in 2020. It tends to be high-end or super premium products. So their volumes grew by almost 19 percentage points. But again, they grew revenue even faster, over 21%. Another fast-growing category was tequila and mezcal. Again, volumes were up over 10 percentage points, but revenues were up even faster by 17%. So again, we saw a lot of that growth in the high-end and super premium categories. Now, the one category that did not do so well was single malt Scotch. Volumes were down by 6.5%, so was revenue. It was down by 2.1 percentage points. To put that into perspective, if you look at the previous 10 years, we saw an average growth rate of around almost 8% when you look at volume and almost 11% when you look at revenue. Clearly, the tariffs negatively impacted single malt Scotch whiskey. Next slide. And finally, one other category that really did extremely well in 2020 was premixed cocktails. The category grew by 35% in volume and almost 40% in revenue. Now, these are amazing growth numbers. And in fact, even though premixed cocktails only account for less than 3% of total industry volume, they accounted for over 17% of industry growth. So really a phenomenal growth rate. A couple things drove that. One, obviously, many people were at home. So if you weren't adventuresome enough to make your own margarita, make your own Manhattan, you might have been buying a premixed cocktail. Additionally, a lot of this is also driven by the ready-to-drink market. Next slide. Now, we've seen an explosion in products offered in the ready-to-drink market. We have not yet caught up with Canada. Canada, a few years ago, changed a lot of its laws, a lot of the public policy around spirits-based ready-to-drink that allowed those products to compete. Well, we're starting in fact, today, there are over 100 companies that are in the market offering, I think it's close to 600 brands and line extensions. We're seeing that trend begin here in the United States, but we've got a long way to go. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned, we have a lot of potential here in the United States. Even though the ready-to-drink market grew by over 30%, the growth rate, I believe, will actually accelerate here in the coming years. Now, the good news is that when we look at the ready-to-drink market, all that growth is actually coming from beer, current flavored malt beverages, wine, and cider. It does not, particularly in Canada, it does not seem to have impacted the growth of traditional spirits. Now, the consumer sees these products not really as beer. AC Nielsen did a recent survey, and they found that 60% of consumers consider these products to be their own market. So while the market in the United States is developing rapidly, we're really looking towards some of those public policy changes with regard to taxes and distribution, like they saw in Canada, that allowed Canada to enjoy such rapid growth. Now, based upon the Canadian experience, I believe the market potential in the United States for spirits-based RTDs is around 280 million cases, which would be worth over $7 billion in supplier revenues. That's a lot of potential growth when you look at the fact that our current supplier revenues are only at around $31 billion. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Leslie. Leslie?
Thank you, David. Okay. Thank you, David. I'd love to talk about the question that we keep seeing quite a bit, which is, are Americans drinking more during the pandemic? First, I'd like to mention that responsibility.org is an independent, not-for-profit funded by some of America's leading distillers. We have 3 missions. We fight drunk driving, we prevent underage drinking, and we promote responsible consumption among those Americans who choose to drink. We're actually celebrating our 30th anniversary this year, and we should note that we're very proud that drunk driving fatalities have decreased 36% since our inception in 1991, and lifetime underage drinking has decreased 45% in that same time frame. That said, we are very aware that there's always more work to be done, and we have been watching very closely the pandemic's impact on alcohol consumption. As David mentioned earlier, the growth rate did decline throughout the year, and our research would seem to mirror his findings. We surveyed 1,000 American adults in early May 2020, and again, just last month, January 2021, and learned that the proportion of American adults who report consuming alcohol within the last 30 days has actually fallen during the pandemic. It was 79 in 2020 and 63 in 2021. And we also found that most American adults, 87%, are confident that they drink responsibly. And then we also asked Americans their reasons for drinking less if they responded as such. The top 3 reasons, as you can see, are not being able to go out, personal health reasons, and the fact that bars and restaurants were closed. So all this said, there's dry January, there's sober October, but we would contend that any day of the year is a good day to sort of reassess your relationship with alcohol. Some people should not drink at all. But for those who do choose to drink, we encourage that everyone in this great industry should be an ambassador for responsibility and do their part to sort of promote responsibility throughout every day of every year. Thank you so much. I'd love to turn it over to Sarah Fitzmaurice, our Chief of Resource Planning for Discus. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. I'm very excited to share with everyone today some new developments and activities and opportunities that we have been working on for the industry for 2021. And first up, we are going to talk about Discus Academy. We're very excited about Discus Academy. It's our new education initiative focused on business education for the industry. Education is taught in 1-hour masterclass style presentations, and classes can be taken either a la carte or as part of a greater certificate program. The training and professional development is focused in 5 key areas: business management and finance, sales and marketing, safety and risk management, laws and regulations, and leadership development. And our leadership development certificate program is currently open and accepting applications through tomorrow. And that both of those leadership certificate programs are in partnership with Cornell University. So to learn more about the leadership certificate or any of our course offerings, you can find information at www.discusacademy.com. Next up, we are so excited to announce our 2021 Discus Annual Conference. It is currently scheduled October 6th through the 8th in Austin, Texas. It's right now scheduled as a live event with virtual components, but we will certainly pivot if needed based on how things progress throughout the year. But we're excited that if everyone can save the date and put that on their calendar, registration will look to open in April. It will have the same great networking and content that it had, that our conference had last year, but with the new addition of a trade show. So we're very excited and hope to see you all in Austin. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Chris.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Look, 2020 was an extraordinary year for our industry. As Phil mentioned earlier, in the early days of the pandemic, well over 865 distilleries around the country rose to the challenge and started manufacturing hand sanitizer. And it was such a proud moment for our industry. And look, we recognize this has been a tough time for all. And just on behalf of the Distilled Spirits Council and Responsibility.org, it is just a great privilege for all of us that work here to represent such a great industry. Look, it was a year of growth, but it was an uneven year. We've got to really double down and help our hospitality sector in the coming months. I think that is imperative, and we all agree with that. Advocacy is a team sport, and Discus has been lucky to work with a lot of different organizations around the country. Many of the guilds, the craft guilds around the country, have been great assets, advocacy assets. Spirits United has been instrumental. In the early days of December, trying to pass the craft beverage bill, we were able to generate over 40,000 letters to members of Congress. It's a team sport. And Discus is committed to working with great organizations like ADI, the American Beverage Licensees, WSWA, great allies for us in working on a lot of issues. ACSA, the Kentucky Distillers Association and Texas Whiskey Association. I could go on and on. The Texas Distilled Spirits Association in Austin. It's a team effort. And, we are fully committed to making sure that Discus does its part to help bring this industry back stronger and healthier. And we're going to work every day to try to resolve the tariff issues and so forth. So we've got an exciting year ahead. Next slide, Leslie. A lot of challenges ahead. We're going to need everybody's help. We're very excited about Discus Academy, as Sarah talked about. Certainly, hopefully the vaccine gets out and we're all going to be together in Austin, Texas, October 6th through the 8th. That'll be a good time if we can pull it together and navigate through the pandemic. Certainly, Spirits United is just a critical tool to ensure that our voice is heard with policymakers. So thank everybody for joining. We want to take some Q&As, and I think, Leslie, you're going to lead that. Yep. And again, it's a privilege to represent such a great industry.
Hey, Leslie, this is Philip. I just wanted to add one more piece, and it's been stated throughout this presentation, but I can't underscore the importance of Responsibility.org, the work that they have done for the last 30 years. And as a craft distiller, it's wonderful to have leadership bringing our industry together, whether it's suppliers or on-premise accounts, wholesalers, distillers, consumers, and teaching everyone that it's wonderful to enjoy what we make, but it's also equally important that we enjoy it responsibly. So I just want to give a plug, and I'm very proud of the work Discus has done there. Thank you.
Great message, Phil. Let me just say to everybody, look, as Leslie reported, underage drinking and drunk driving fatalities, they're all going in the right direction at low levels, but that is always a license to operate, right? So, and that is a collective effort. It's a collective effort on how we live by example, all of us in the industry, and being evangelists for responsibility in everything that we do. So Leslie, over to you.
Awesome. That is really nice of you, Phil. Thank you so much for saying that. All right, here's some questions. I think the first one's off to David Asgo from Yar Maroon. I hope I'm saying that name correctly. How do you explain the 7.7% increase with bars and restaurants closed?
Sure, that's a good question. Well, as I mentioned, one of the factors that allowed us to grow was the fact that when you look at the marketplace in the U.S. for spirits, 80% of all sales were already going through off-premise channels, and that's in volume terms. So when you look at supplier revenues, that means that 80% of our revenue was in the off-premise channel. So it really wasn't much of a stretch for the consumer to shift what had been on-premise consumption into off-premise. As I mentioned, we have a tradition of in-home entertaining here in the United States. A lot of people became their own in-home bartenders, and I know a lot of them, from what I understand, are very, very proud of the fact it's not just having a drink; it's actually a ritual that they've come to enjoy. So that's what really drove our sales.
Okay, thanks, David. Any idea why the value segment hasn't grown or stayed flat? I'm curious to hear thoughts on this, especially with the boom in nostalgic drinks during COVID that were offered at a lower price point than craft brands.
Sure. Well, a lot of when we look at the trend over time in the United States has been toward more and more premiumization. I've been talking about it for 20 years now, but when I've gone back to read the historic literature, you can even read about premiumization in, say, the 1970s. So very often today, what is regarded as a premium brand years ago might have been a high-end or super premium brand. So the consumer really enjoys something better. Spirits are oftentimes very much aspirational. Everybody, I often say that, while a man or woman making $70,000 a year can't necessarily go out and buy a new Tesla, they can afford a $60 bottle of bourbon or an $80 bottle of cognac. So as a result, what it means is the consumer has been trading up. They've been doing it for some time. It's really what we regard as an affordable luxury.
Awesome. Thank you, David. From Zach at Bourbon Review, is there any indication that the issue with tariffs will be removed or reduced in the near future based on recent actions of the current administration?
I'll take that. Look, we've seen positive overtures coming out of the EU with the Biden administration coming in, and President Biden has been very, very public about the desire to reset the relationship with the EU. So we are very, very hopeful. We're a little anxious because it's taken some time for the key political designees within the Biden administration just to get confirmed by the Senate and get seated. But we're hopeful that there is an environment and a path to get these issues resolved. From 1997 to 2018, June 2018, we saw great import and export growth between the US and the EU. And our goal is to get back to that. And a big part of that is to end the tariffs on American whiskey, the tariffs on single malt Scotch and cognac, and American vodka and rum and so forth. So it's a team effort. And as Christine had mentioned, we're working very, very closely with our partners in Europe and in the UK as well.
Great, thank you. From Mr. Marinoff, what percentage of the growth was RTD?
Well, overall, the premixed cocktails was 35%. RTD for spirits-based RTDs was actually a fairly small component of that because it's still a rapidly developing market. I don't have the exact figure, but it was not that large. Even though the category or the segment is growing rapidly, it's too small to really have an impact just yet.
Okay, great. Jonathan Newton asked, when we return to more normal operations for the on-premise, what consumer trends do you think will remain or emerge?
Well, the consumers always liked variety and enjoyed variety. I think the fact that a lot of them now are making their own cocktails at home will tell you they're going to probably be a little bit more demanding of their bartenders once they get back into the on-premise trade. So it's really that variety. It's the new drinks that come out. It's the new brands. I think all that's going to be very, very important. Probably within a few months after opening up, I suspect early on, people are just going to be so happy to be out again that they'll, there'll be ecstatic just be out again, and you won't see anything change dramatically. But thereafter, they're going to say, you know what, I made this at home. What else can you do for me now, bartender? So it'll be an exciting time for the on-premise trade.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's see. I just had it. Christian Fernandez asks, what are the prospects on U.S. exports to other regions, such as Latin America, Asia, and North America?
I would say one thing, and Christine can jump in on this, high hopes, great possibilities. Discus does lead a program called a Market Access Program, where we get a great deal of funding from the U.S. Department of Agriculture to help promote American distilled spirits overseas. And even though we've been blunted because of the tariffs with the EU, the Market Access Program has been a great platform for distillers around the country to participate in. So let us know about that. American whiskey was on the rise all around the world pre-pandemic and pre-tariffs coming from the EU. And that also includes markets in Asia or Latin America or other parts of the world as well.
I would just add to that, the U.S. has many free trade agreements that are already in place, and there are several markets around the world where we already have duty-free access. So, for example, Australia is a really important market for U.S. exporters. It ranks as the third overall, and we saw a 9% increase in the value of our exports to Australia last year. So that's an important market. We have duty-free access. Also in a market like Korea, as well as Japan. We don't have a free trade agreement with Japan, but they have duty-free for all distilled spirits. So there are a lot of opportunities in places where American spirits compete on a level playing field. And happy to provide further information on that, but that just gives you a sense of some of the opportunities that exist in other parts of the world.
Great, thanks, Christine. All right, we're going to do two more. One from Brian Tracy. The 5.3 volume growth, do we know which markets we are pulling from and the demographics of those switching markets?
Certainly. We know that we're definitely pulling from beer. That's where most of our market share growth has come from. We did grow faster than wine, so a bit was likely coming from wine, but I believe most of it is coming from beer. Now, as far as demographics, when we look at the demographics of who is driving our growth right now, it's really across the board. Men and women of all ages are enjoying our products. And in fact, when you look at the data, women today are just as likely to be drinking spirits as men. So it's really across the board, which is great because that means we have a very, very demographically, we're very, very strong, and that really sets us up for future growth.
Okay, thanks, David. All right, we have one more. Let's see. Sorry, let me find it. Okay. How do you see the recent acquisition of Drizzly by Uber will impact the spirits market overall, as well as the push for DTC? This is from Aaron Petrie of Bourbon and Banter.
Great question. Look, really, really exciting news, and kudos to WSWA, our friends at Drizzly. They were at the right place at the right time at the beginning of the pandemic, and we've seen great growth. And it just confirms that e-commerce in many, many different forms is going to be a big element of how consumers shop. So it's really exciting news. We think we want to give great kudos to the Drizzlies and the LibDibs, and many of the e-commerce platforms are out there, and it just affirms that consumers are wanting to shop and try new products that way. And I think that really feeds into the direct shipping issue, where direct shipping of wine has been around for quite some time, and that just presents another consumer channel for distilled spirits consumers as well. So we were excited to see that news, and it's a great opportunity. It just confirms where consumers are heading, and the industry is going to have to adapt to that.
Great, thank you, Chris. All right, we promised everyone we would end on time, so I'm trying to honor our promise. It's 2 o'clock. We see a lot of great questions too, so we'll follow up with folks individually who have listed their names, and then we will post the recording on our website and follow up with an email after this. So on behalf of Discus and Responsibility.org, we do really appreciate you joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thanks
you
for joining us.